Hi, this is Paul. When I first started in with the Jordan Peterson stuff, it became immediately obvious that Carl Jung was a big part of it. And so one of the things that I did was read his book, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And one of my big takeaways from that book was when he was a young psychologist learning, he was a young doctor and he was working in a mental health facility. The older doctors told him, well, don't bother talking to these people, they're crazy. And he thought, well, what are we supposed to do here? So he did begin talking to the people. And one of the key insights that he took away from it is that the story on the inside somehow relates to the story on the outside, and that there was a degree of health that could be found if you can begin to work those stories together in a productive way. This is basically about how human beings navigate the world. Stories, as I've mentioned in previous videos, stories are astounding compression algorithms. They're also enormously scalable. Fairly early on, John Vervaeke had a conversation with Benjamin Boyce, and that's where I sort of first heard John's take on story. Now, we don't start out using story the way we do, but by the age of 3 or 4, we're able to basically start some sort of autobiography that very quickly becomes a self as such. Now, why is that so important? Well, because the world is too big. And again, this is one of Jordan Peterson's main points to Sam Harris when they were having their conversations a couple of years ago. The world is too big. And so the world has to be compressed in order for us to manage it well and to interact with it productively. Jordan Peterson's main point in Maps of Meaning, where he begins, you can think about the world as a set of objects, but again, there's way too many objects, or a form for action, because action, figuring out how to act, or in the case of human beings, what to say, how to speak, is really integral to us engaging productively with the world. If you want to live, you have to act. And so story, big stories outside and the story inside. In many ways, we are autobiographies. That's one of the most potent definitions of the self that we have. This is how we manage our lives. This is how we manage our worlds. This is how we prioritize. This is how we decide what of the myriad of things I pay attention to, what deserves my immediate attention, and how I must act in response to the world around me. And again, all of this we, from a very early on, learn how to do natively. And these stories live in us, and we live in far broader stories. And we see this so consistently in politics right now, in that, at least in the United States, there's sort of two political parties with very different narratives about who the United States is, what its history is, and these narratives then shape all of the other input that comes to them. So they look across the aisle and they think, are they stupid? Are they crazy? Are they evil? And they just keep doing that because they've got these dominant narratives that are governing all of the input. And then whenever new input comes in, they have to sort of figure out how that fits into their framework. And all of this is done via story. And again, it's not story as such necessarily, where there's a set story together, but our minds somehow manage all of these stories and narratives and put them together and keep them in that way. Now, pastors and therapists both are in some ways curators of stories, and a therapist will sit down, and this is a picture of Tony Soprano sitting there with Dr. Melfi, which is just a classic show, because that show in some ways noted some of the exposure of modern therapy, because modern therapy will ask you, well, are you feeling better? That the task of modern therapy is not so much, are you moral? And really, and so that's partly what at least some of the early seasons of The Soprano were working on, because, well, the crisis that Dr. Melfi had in terms of, well, if she's a successful doctor, Tony Soprano will be a more successful mob boss. And so secular therapists in some ways do sort of a dead reckoning with respect to well-being. I've mentioned before that in many ways for Jordan Peterson, meaning is sort of a compass. And Peterson hints that there might be a GPS system out there that we're guided by, but secularism doesn't really afford anything outside the box. And you can see that when Sam Harris basically tries to double down with his well-being assumption, and that's part of what Jordan Peterson probed with him in their conversations. Now, religion, however, so as a pastor, certainly you look at well-being, but there's also a bigger, broader moral narrative and moral matrix that pastors are working on. But of course, religion sort of tracks all of these narratives and facilitates the conversations between them. Religions are in some ways in a constant state of recalibration, and sometimes all the way up to and including warfare, in order to try to determine, well, what is true? What do we know? How do we work together with this? What sources of information do we have? Do you have divine revelation? Do you have the inner movement of the Spirit of God? Or do you have divine light? Or, various religions have all sorts of ways of doing this, but these religions are massive mappings of the world and how we are to orient ourselves, who we are. Basically, religions tell us the basic categories of what we are, who we are, how the world works, etc. Now, storied communities require platforms. One of the videos that maybe I'll get to it this week, I don't know. One of the videos that I've been thinking about is I've been thinking a lot about platforms that afford sort of a communal intentionality and a direction. Churches, of course, did that. But other platforms also sort of facilitate transformations. And so stories act virally between people normally because we are always, and this isn't our conscious self, our unconsciously and subconsciously, we are always mapping and comparing maps, always recalibrating, always trying to see, how does the world work? Does this fit into my mapping? This sticks out in my mapping. Can I integrate it? Can I not integrate it? I'll leave it to the side for now. And we're constantly doing this internally as human beings. And if religions are, of course, a big part of this, but there are platforms for this. And so stories do spread virally, but long ago, human beings began to use platforms. And so when you look at temples and statues and carvings and runes and cave drawings, all of this is part of sort of the creation of platforms by which human beings work together on their stories. Now, human beings are enormously social beings, and so we're always recalibrating our stories of reality one with each other. It's sort of this massive mesh network, and so we watch each other, and it's the source of a lot of our conflicts and source of a lot of our communities. But we've been doing this as human beings for a very long time. Words and books became huge, powerful platforms by which we began to map and compare stories and check back and forth. And again, all of these stories don't have to be story form narrative as such. It can be poetry. It can be, just about anything that we communicate with each other. We're always checking these mappings and checking back and forth. One of the things that we've seen in the modern period is the vast proliferation of platforms, newspapers, political parties, fashion, fads, arts, radio, television, the internet. We've just had this explosion of platforms by which we're always doing this story mapping, transformation, comparing, recalibration, what we're doing all the time. Now, they all convey implicit and explicit stories through which people can map themselves onto a bigger map. Rick just told me yesterday about this Gallup poll that Christianity Today is reporting on, or the Religion News Network is reporting on, saying that fewer than half of Americans belong to a church. Churches for the United States were a very important platform. Even immigrants who weren't necessarily attending church overseas, churches would then be, that was true of the Christian Reformed Church, sort of a communal buffered cultural platform that would allow one or two or three generations to begin to assimilate into the broader stories that were in the region. And, well, it'll be interesting to see what happens with churches as we're experiencing this new massive wave of immigration again today. But I think part of the reason churches have been receding is because there are just so many competing platforms. The categorization of religion and not religious is, I think, something that is very much going to go away, because that categorization is a function of secularism, and secularism and Christian modernity are deeply intertwined. Now again, this recession can take hundreds of years, and so when I say going away, well, not in our lifetimes, but this is the process that's happening around us. So, as if you've listened to some of my other videos, my wife tested positive for COVID. Myself and my two daughters, all of whom are, that's the four of us living at home right now, we all tested negative, so we don't know if it's a false positive or a false negative. So my wife is holed up in our bedroom, and I'm living in my son who is at college right now. I'm living in his room, and I was, trying to have some social distance from my daughters before we got our test results back. And so what am I going to do? Well, recently, I don't know how I found it, but I sort of got hooked on this History Channel show of Vikings. And what grabbed me onto it was the reincorporation of religion in their worldview. And someone, I was talking about this on Twitter, and someone said that Bishop Barron had made a video about it, and that was back in 2016. It was a little 8-minute video that Bishop Barron had made. So I watched that, and my responses were very much like his. And he commented on Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, before 500 years ago. Everything was religious. Everyone was religious. And so it was really quite good the way religion is sort of incorporated into this. And then someone on Twitter tweeted me this, which I thought was an excellent observation. Myths are well depicted in their function to orienting moral action. The force and weakness of paganism is well portrayed. It integrates better the wicked aspects of human beings than Christianity. Christianity helps better in integrating the tribes. And so I thought that was a very helpful tweet. It's interesting watching this compared to, let's say, I guess the reason the show took me by surprise is that so much television would focus on, okay, there's the drama between people that people pay attention to. There's the sword play and the violence, and that's what we pay attention to. There's the, sexual tension and romance, and that's what we pay attention to. But the way that religion is shaping the world, I thought was quite interesting. Now, I don't know enough history of that period, or especially Viking history, to have a sense of how accurately there's a fair amount of bleed through. I mean, sometimes when the characters talk, they sort of sound like evangelical Vikings, but it's just watching, and of course there's the strong female characters, and how close is that to history? I have no idea. I can't compare. But I think the show is quite well done, and at least for the first 3 seasons, which were the ones that I was able to watch on Amazon Prime, it held my interest, and I went through them fairly quickly. It's interesting comparing them to, let's say, the Ten Commandments or Ben-Hur, these sword and sandal movies that were very big in the 1950s. Now, of course, the heroes are conflicted. The heroes in the 1950s were far more sure of themselves. You can see that even in the Lord of the Rings movie. And Tim Keller, often when he talk about the Lord of the Rings movie as compared to Tolkien, Aragorn in Tolkien's work knows exactly what he's doing. Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings movie in Peter Jackson's Aragorn is always, he's fishing for his meaning and his purpose, and that's supposed to connect to the audience. And it says a lot about the time and the age. What's pretty cool about Vikings is that it's clear that there are larger stories at play. And more, more attention is focused on the Vikings than the Christians, and so you get the sense of Odin and Odin's relationship with the characters and how those work out. And it also comes very clear that you have a clash of civilizations, and it's the clash of the gods, and that comes through with the characters. And so it's really, I've really been enjoying it. And I think probably as modernity continues to recede, we're increasingly going to see the Cold War as such. That certainly it was a clash of civilizations, and maybe even the clash of the gods of these civilizations. Now, that got me thinking, how many times in those Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversations did Sam Harris's fascination with superheroes come up? So I began, you can search for keywords in the transcripts, and so I began watching a few of them, and I thought maybe I'd play some from the third talk. Jordan on his channel labels them AA, AB, and AC. Which is really a rather smart way to label them. And Douglas Murray is in this one, and I think, of course, Douglas Murray is quite potent in this. And I thought about this quite a bit because recently I never really gave full treatment to the Jordan Peterson, Bret Weinstein talk. I had thought about doing a video with that, but often with these videos, I'll watch a video and then I'll let it sit. And if certain elements of the video keep coming up, well, then it's sort of a sign to me to, okay, well, maybe I should do a video about that and take a little closer work in some of these aspects. Jordan Peterson and Bret Weinstein were talking about the transgender conversation. And Jordan was talking about how he's been watching his granddaughter and how his granddaughter has a name that her father calls her and a name that her mother calls her. But one of her favorite names right now is that she's Pocahontas. And Jordan notes that at a very young age, his granddaughter is quite young. At a very young age, you're trying on identities. And this sort of gets back to Jung, where are the menus from which you try your identities from? Now, of course, your daddy is mapping onto you and your mommy is mapping onto you, and all of that is a first draft. But obviously something grabbed her interest about this Pocahontas character, and it's probably from a movie or something like it, maybe a Disney cartoon. And then what usually happens is parents notice that, oh, she's excited about Pocahontas, and so grandparents will buy a Pocahontas lunchbox or a Pocahontas backpack or a Pocahontas pillow, and it's sort of, the child continues to facilitate their identity transformation and their identity. Now, she will likely not be 10 years old and still thinks she's Pocahontas. That will pass, but there are elements of Pocahontas that will map on into her, and for her whole life long, pieces of her will always be connected with the story outside. And that's, again, where we get back in touch with Jung in terms of the story outside and the story inside. We keep trying on identities and we match them up to the world, and that's where Jordan Peterson and Bret Weinstein were talking about the fact that, if you're trying on identities that don't fit very well, the friction and resistance that you get from other people will be very important to help you recalibrate your identity to actually get one that fits in the world. And maybe I should pull that video up and play some of it, because I thought it was rather a good conversation.
Forces are in that developmental landscape has a lot to say about both the insights and the blind spots of the people who emerge from it. And so I would say that
a little frustrated, and I shouldn't be one to talk because I can take far too long to say something that I want to say, but this whole section takes a while in this conversation. Maybe this will have to be 2 videos because I've got quite a bit mapped out here.
For Americans of my generation, I'm a Gen X, the market played too much of a role developmentally, and it has created a kind of lens through which we can't help but look. It has, commodified things in a way that is quite unhealthy.
You were born when?
I was born in 1969.
Okay.
For millennials, and maybe even more so for Gen Z, I suspect that there is a pivot to something else. And many people, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have certainly talked about iGen, the internet generation. But what I suspect is really going on is that if you are sufficiently plugged into the internet early enough, there comes a point at which your persona on the internet takes primacy. It is more important than your actual physical life persona.
It's worse than that. It's worse than that, I would say, from personal experience. There's more of me on the internet than there is in me.
I guess
my electronic avatar.
I guess I'm to a degree responsible for that.
Are far more powerful than me personally, and right. I can watch this because I've been away for a year and a half, and yet
imagine that as the developmental environment for children. Now, here's the connection I want to draw. My contention is that the online landscape is postmodern, right? That if we were just to simply describe it, the rules, the physics of online life are postmodern.
Because it's abstracted from the environment.
Right. So, for example,
it's like living in a dictionary.
If I
was frustrated by this because Brett takes a long time to make the point, but I love Peterson's. I love where Peterson takes this.
Decided tomorrow that I was a woman, right?
I mean, and when Peterson says it's like living in a dictionary, that's such a key insight. That's such a leap in saying, okay, so what is the internet? How does the internet relate to the rest of the world? Kind of like, now again, dictionary isn't great, but it evokes something of the relationship.
I could change my internet presence such that I would present in a female way.
Okay, and again, I don't think Brett's example here is terribly strong, but where Jordan takes it, I think, is much more helpful.
I have such things as you can. No man has ever become a woman and reproduced in a female way, right? So from physics, for whom the real frightening, but we understand, is a generally to live by. What has to be true for that to be the case, right?
Glasses, like the Google glasses, that would be illegal to take off. And that Google glass.
What has to be true for that to be the case, right?
I had a fantasy a long while ago that people would end up wearing glasses, like the Google glasses, that would be illegal to take off. And that you'd be mandated to see what people wanted you to see. It was their right to be presented to you in the manner that they chose to present themselves. And I'm not saying that's a particularly brilliant vision, but it's very much in keeping with what you're describing. So,
yep, I think it's close. But if you imagine that, we can all discussion if we are in those for whom the real world has primacy and those for whom the online world has primacy, and if that's not the fundamental nature of the battle.
Well, I think it could be the fundamental nature of a part of the battle. I mean, part of what's going on is whatever this unbelievably rapid rate of technological transformation is doing to us. I mean, my daughter and some people of approximately her age, so late 20s, are helping me with manage social media, let's say. She's noticed that people 5 years younger than her have advantages in understanding the newly developed forms of social media that she's already outside of. And so that process of being hooked into the web and that being the determining factor for your worldview is probably accelerating. I mean, it's going to accelerate. Obviously, it's going to accelerate because the web is becoming more and more dominant and machines are becoming more and more intelligent. So they abstract themselves away from the world. And then the question is, well, what's the consequence of that abstraction? But it's funny that it's postmodern. There's more going on with whatever it is that's happening than technological transformation. But you think that's the fundamental driving factor?
Well, real used to primacy, but from which they get to advent battle. And so my point is that is a distortion developmentally. It misleads the mind into misunderstanding what is necessary. If you take the postmodern rules of the internet, that it is Christ, that the ring of are in grave danger and hard progress.
And I thought, I had thought about this obsession with identity from a developmental perspective too. And I thought this insistence by a loud minority that their determination of their identity take primacy is, first of all, it's wrong technically, I think, because an identity isn't merely what you feel you are. An identity is way more complicated than that, as any decent social constructionist should already know. An identity is a role, a set of complex roles that you negotiate with other people so that you can thrive across a very long span of time. And it can't be something that you impose on other people, because then they won't cooperate with you. Now, you might say that you have a right to impose certain aspects of it on other people, and you could have a reasonable debate about that, but identity is definitely not merely what you feel it is, and it's certainly not merely what you feel it is moment to moment. That identity is actually much more like that of a 3 or 4-year-old child. And I mean this technically, it's not an insult. So when you're a child, you pick up one identity after another and play with them. So for example, my granddaughter, who's about 3 at the moment, if you ask her who she is, she has 2 names, a first name and a second name, and her dad calls her by her second name and her mom calls her by her first name. So she's Ellie or Scarlett, and she's fine with either of those. But she's also Pocahontas. And if you ask her whether she's Ellie or Scarlett or Pocahontas, she will say Pocahontas. And she has said that for 8 months. It's amazing. It's been that persistent in a child of that age. It's quite remarkable. But what she's doing is playing, and girls will play to be boys at that age, and boys will play to be girls. And they play with multitudinous identities, and then they settle into one. So then the question is, what if you disrupt that play? That's fantasy play. And then another question might be, well, what if you disrupt it with technology? Not that technology itself is producing a message that's counter to that, but that the fact that children are on technology all the time means they're not engaging in that kind of identity establishing fantasy play. And then you might say, well, maybe what you see happening in that case is that it bursts out in late adolescence.
Well, and it also might be that children aren't doing this stuff directly. We don't do these things consciously. Children just do it. And so we have no idea how the technology, in fact, is playing around with this. Let's imagine, because, okay, I talked about platforms. So Pocahontas, the Pocahontas that is in Jordan Peterson's granddaughter, lives upon a platform. Lives upon the platform probably of Walt Disney. And that platform has videos that are out there available on the television. And of course, one of the things that we know, there are, dolls, and there are backpacks, and there are pajamas, and there are there are Pocahontas costumes. And so what we do with our children is we have these identities that are living on platforms, and people live into those platforms, and those stories are out there in the world, and then they get into us, and we keep trying them out. I should probably not subject you all to my fast forwarding to the places, as it's a little rude on my part and maybe a little bit lazy, but well, let's see.
And the insistence there that my identity is what I say it is actually the scream in some sense of an organism that hasn't gone through that egocentric period of play where they are, in a fictional sense, exactly the way they define themselves. You can't tell my granddaughter, who's 3, that she isn't Pocahontas. It's stupid to tell her that, because she means it in an experimental sense. And all you're doing is interfering with her fantasy play. And so I see a fair bit of this as delayed fantasy play with the kind of pathology that comes up when you delay a necessary developmental stage. Now, that could be wrong, when probably is, but still, it looks to me like that's part of what's happening.
Yes. I'm more familiar with the male side of this because I went through boyhood and being a young man. But if you have a misunderstanding about how you present in the world, so you assert that you are one way, then your peers will, if your peers are nice, they will poke fun at you in order to reveal to you what it is that you actually present as, so that you can adjust your self-image.
Right, and that's
because we can't see ourselves, and that's what we rely on others for. But again, the matrix from which your peers are going to be poking fun of you is all from those stories on the outside.
That's part of healthy socialization. That's what happens. That's it. Once you pull out of that egocentric stage where you're playing with yourself, then you have to integrate other people into your play, and then it's a negotiation. Otherwise, right, you're not accepted by your peers. And so that's another thing that's very interesting, is that it is precisely those children who aren't accepted by their peers that insist that their self-definitions rule. And then one of the things that's kind of terrifying about that is, if you know the child antisocial literature, there's a percentage of children that are quite aggressive at the age of 2. Almost all of them are male. Almost all of them are socialized out of their aggression by the time they're 4.
And Peterson's made this point before, but part of what's happened in our culture is now we have, as a broader culture, said, well, you ought not to challenge anybody's social self-identification, well, unless they're on Twitter, and it's going to be a food fight. But you ought not challenge them to their face. And so then we get all this weirdness that we're living in the midst of right now. And in fact, what happens is they, in fact, do get challenged, but usually in the most unloving, unproductive way you might imagine. Okay, now we'll get to the video that I intended to play.
The concern about where you might be taking us. Or to put it another way, if we enter the world that you would suggest.
Now Sam Harris, in terms of, well, everything is, okay, it's sort of a world of objects, and everything is out there, and we're going to use reason and directness, and that's how human beings work. We work very directly, and if there's a goal, we can see, well, that goal will help my well-being, and I'm going to pursue that goal. Douglas Murray has some questions about that.
Not everyone may necessarily come out as Sam Harris.
Well, give me one way where you think it can go wrong. And again, we can't forget your caveat, which you started with.
What if you're not very smart?
Right. Well, so then you're basically saying that the stupid people need their myths. We smart people on stage don't need them.
Right.
But,
well, I am.
Well, okay. Well, what are these myths? Well, these myths are these stories that we live within. And so the identities such as Pocahontas or Batgirl or Spider-Man or, and again, now we've got these platforms. Now, in the ancient world, the platforms were from the religion and the temples and the characters in your town. Now we've got this proliferation of platforms where Pocahontas from a story, and we're a long ways from the 8th, 9th, or 10th century, and we're very long ways from the 2nd or 3rd millennia BC.
I actually am saying that to some degree. Look, if you're not exceptionally cognitively astute, you should be traditional and conservative, because if you can't think well, you're going to think badly, and if you think badly, you're going to fall into trouble. And so it is definitely the case, and this has been what would you call a cliche of political belief for a long time. If you're not very smart, it's better to be conservative, because then you do what everyone else does. And generally speaking, doing what everyone else does is the path of least error moving forward. Now, that doesn't mean that rationality is unnecessary.
Nor does it mean that all conservatives are stupid.
It doesn't mean that either. Right, precisely. It doesn't mean that either.
Very important caveat.
Yes,
but all conservative structures are not the same either, and that we have many warring and incompatible versions of being conservative.
True. And this is where rationality actually does play its role. although I don't think it's best conceptualized as rationality precisely, it's definitely the case that to take Douglas's point, that we need to be bound by our traditions, but we need to be judicious in their re-representation and update, and we have to do both.
This is what, in the dialogue on religion, this is what Schopenhauer says. He describes the tragedy of the clergy.
Yeah.
He pretty much says, look, if they don't believe it, they recognize it's a very useful metaphor, but they don't need to believe it. They tell it, and he says the tragedy of the clergy is they can never admit that what they're saying is just a metaphor.
Right. And this is where, Vikings was such a breath of fresh air, because everyone there does believe it. Almost everyone. There's the King of Wessex, who is, he has his Roman bath, and he has these Roman statues, and he has these fragments of the text of Julius Caesar conquering Gaul, and so he's the modernity seeps into it, of course, and so but he's also seen as being corrupt. I mean, he will attempt to seduce a family member. He will backstab, and I mean he can be enormously duplicitous. But to get to this point now, Sam's about to take a shot at Schopenhauer, but this is where, okay, in many ways it doesn't work if you don't believe it, and this gets into the resurrection, the physicality of the resurrection thing again. The fact that Pocahontas is a historical figure at some point might lead someone to say, well, I can exemplify and embody and act out successfully aspects of Pocahontas's identity because it has already happened once. And this is part of the difference that Lewis points out between Odin and how many dying and resurrecting gods that you find in mythology, that in Christianity, well, it's only really the outliers who say Jesus of Nazareth didn't exist. That's not a terribly easy point to make.
Right. Is this before or after he threw his housekeeper down the stairs?
Look, we can all find flaws.
We all have skeletons in our closet. Yeah.
But yes, there is a way in which religion is what he describes as philosophy for the masses. And that if you recognize that most people are not going to spend their lives studying philosophy, they're not going to be reading about the differences between Leibniz and Kant, that religion has to do.
And of course, this point is always made as sort of an elitist, scalable point, and Peterson just said high and low intelligence. But I think it goes far deeper than that, because philosophy is, of course, a well-developed scaling an abstraction above life that story isn't. I was making the point in our our men's Bible study, our online men's Bible study, that if you want to look at, let's say, the subtle conversation within the Hebrew scriptures about in-group and out-group, you can look at Moabite women as an example, and you can look at a story in where the Moabite women are seducing the young men of Israel. You can look at the book of Ezra, where there's a lot of in-group, out-group stuff going on in the book of Ezra when the exiles come back, and the land has been repopulated and they're trying to find their identity. But then you can also look at the book of Ruth, and what you find that as story is an astoundingly capable compression narrative, of which we have, you have your CPU and your GPU, and it's my son is trying to build a computer and he's pulling out his hair trying to find a GPU because all the Bitcoiners are mining Bitcoin. But in many ways we are maximized. It's like we have a GPU for story, just like your gaming computer has a GPU for graphics, and we're maximized by that GPU for story. And so where was I going with this? So that's this massive compression algorithm, and philosophy isn't just, philosophy is sort of using the CPU, and that's absolutely fine. Again, a computer is much more capable with a good GPU and a good CPU, and so philosophy sort of uses the CPU. It's rational, it's linear, it's up there in that certain way, but the GPU and story, that grabs us. That's what mobilizes us, not just as individuals, but you can mobilize a nation with a story. You don't usually mobilize a nation with philosophy. You might discern some of the mobilization via philosophy, looking at it in that very CPU sort of way, but it's the story, it's the passion. That's how we group up and assemble and cooperate and mobilize and do great good things and do great evil things.
Now, I'm not saying that I agree with that particularly, but there's a heck of an argument within there, which a lot of people will be living their lives in.
I don't think it's a good argument if you recall or just imagine what it's like to be a child, especially from the perspective of being a parent. I have 2 young girls, and
what's interesting is that the GPU comes online first, and the CPU comes on quite a bit later. But again, when you look at the brain books, which is really governing, is the CPU or the GPU?
They're very smart young girls. They're smart, but one of them's 4.5 years old and knows almost nothing, right? So she knows what I and my wife and our society tell her at some level.
I bet she knows almost nothing of what Sam directly tries to tell her, but look at what she does know.
What point is she going to think for herself about these fundamental questions?
And again, when he says think for yourself, he means in the CPU, rational, linear, left brain sort of way. But the GPU is already there, and he's about to.
And she's currently spending half the day dressed up like Batgirl or Catwoman, right? So if I told.
And why? Well, her GPU, her graphics processor, is well online. She's already been mapping Sam and his wife and the grandparents and the video and the TV. She's already been mapping these stories, and these stories are what is inhabiting her in a very deep way. And now, a little bit later, with her CPU, she might learn that she's going to lose status in this way, but that's really what's going to be moving her at a very deep level. And this other stuff, well, she'll just play secular in front of daddy. But what's really moving her is things that she picked up from Catwoman or Batgirl, and those are the things that she will act out in her life.
Told her that these superheroes were real, she would believe that for the longest time. And if
they are real. You just have to ask yourself, what do you mean by real? And again, real doesn't mean merely physical, because most of what governs our world is not physical. Most of what governs our world is the most real thing. And the things that are most real at multiple levels and layers all the way up and down.
If we lived in a cult that thought they were real, or a whole society that by dint of its geographic or linguistic isolation managed to maintain a conversation about, in this case, Batgirl and Catwoman, that they were real and that it was absolutely important to honor them, and you'd burn in hell if you failed to do this.
Well, and in some ways, this is the drama in the story of Vikings. You have Athelstan, and then you have Floki, and this is exactly what's going on in these societies, and Sam's kind of disparaging it, but Again, these are people who are prioritizing evolutionary stories. Basically, if you look at the evidence, all of that GPU, story outside, story inside, that was what created successful societies, not this other thing. And that's part of Douglas Murray's argument that, hey,
we would be meeting fully grown adults.
Do you think that
who believe this sort of thing?
But it seems to me, Sam, that you bring up the superhero thing quite a bit, so I think I'll go after that directly.
Yeah.
So
then I want.
Okay,
I love superheroes.
Okay, so you make the case in A Moral Landscape that an ideal is real. Because the ideal that you define an ideal is real, and the ideal is whatever maximizes well-being and gets us away from hell. You said not only is that real, you also say that's the fundamental axiom. That's the claim in The Moral Landscape. So you do make a claim that there is a real ideal. And I would say...
I wouldn't necessarily put it that way, but we are in a circumstance where things can matter, right? Consciousness is the condition in which things can matter, where there can be a range of...
What do you mean by things? You mean physical things? Or do you mean the things that are actually governing his daughter and governing him because he likes superheroes?
Of experiences, some of which are very, very bad. If the word bad means anything, they're bad. And some of which are very, very good, if the word good means anything. And we are navigating in that space. We can't help but navigate or seek to navigate in that space.
Right, absolutely.
And religion is one form of conversation about that navigation problem. And I would argue
let's go back to the ideal.
Often diluted one.
Like Jordan rolls his sleeves up.
Batgirl.
He means business now.
Batgirl and Catwoman are approximations to a higher ideal. That's what they are.
Well,
and even if you say they're approximations to a higher ideal, you're putting the ideal first. When Catwoman and Batgirl are more powerful than a thing we recognize as an ideal, because the ideal would be the abstraction, like the philosophy. But Catwoman and Batgirl are able to pack more into them because they are storied and we're able to process them with our GPU. There's no way the CPU is going to outcompete it. Now, I've been watching some videos. I'm going to play some that are basically explaining comic books. And Jonathan Peugeot explains symbolism. But for a long time I've been asking myself, okay, what happens when we watch a Jonathan Peugeot video? Well, a lot of what happens is that we're just doing the translation from the GPU to the CPU. We've sort of felt it, and it's moved us, and then along comes the CPU explanation. And, oh, okay, well, part of the benefit of that left brain stuff is that now it's mapped territory, and I can hold it as being mapped propositionally, which is sort of a fairly shelf-stable way to store things. But that's all they are. They're not as powerful as Catgirl and Batwoman or Santa Claus or Floki or Ragnar Lothbrok or all of the people in the characters. Those are the compression. They're more real than a lot of the abstractions. The abstractions are handy because we can kind of take them down and move them around and do things with them. But we keep imagining that the abstraction is the more real. No, the abstraction is a different kind of thing. It's a very powerful thing, but it's almost like it's got a shelf life, and you can just set it there. And it's the abstractions, the propositions, it's all of those kinds of things, but it's nowhere near as powerful as the narrative elements.
To return to this with a biblical idea, I'm fairly sure from personal experience that a lot of parents are perfectly content with bringing their children up vaguely within the story they've inherited. And at some point, the children realize that the fairy doesn't bring them money when their teeth fall out. And at some point, maybe around the same time or a bit later, they discover that Santa Claus doesn't really come down the chimney. And at some point, they realize that actually the whole religious thing is a kind of metaphor, but it's got them through the formative years in some way, often with terrible damage along the way, I concede that. But also with something else. And I'm struck by the number of people, and this is why I share some of what I think is Jordan's concern about the possibility of the world you're envisaging, which is, I can think of a lot of parents now, in my country and other countries as well, who I'm just very struck. They themselves are kind of baby boomer or 60s atheists, humanists, whatever. And I start to notice, for instance, that they're enrolling their children in Christian schools. And I say to them, why are you doing this? And they have fairly coherent arguments along the lines of the one I've just had. Look, I don't particularly believe this myself, but I think it's a pretty good way to bring up the kids. It's a structure of a kind. And I'm not sure, I can find all sorts of flaws in that. But enough people are doing it that it's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, well, I would say yes. It speaks to a real failure of imagination and effort in the secular community to produce truly non-embarrassing alternatives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have to ask, well, first of all, your embarrassment, where is that coming from? And why is it so hard? Because Well, it's sort of like the reason my son can't find a good GPU on the store shelf or in stock at some place on Amazon, because everybody's buying up the GPUs. Why? Because that's what makes the world go round. Oh, but what we really need is we want the CPU to come up with something that can displace what all of the GPU is doing. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen, because how does the stuff that these parents who, well, I don't really believe, I don't go to church or believe in any of that, but I want my kid to learn it. The parents are wiser than they know. They're wiser than their CPU brain. And that goes back to Jordan Peterson's comment about conservatism. Their parents are doing what's been done. It's already been mapped onto them. And so, okay, here's the project. We're going to be very direct, and let's just tell children to be good. But they don't know what good looks like, because good looks, much more than good, is abstracted.
And this is across the board. This is not just school. This is how do you conduct a funeral? How do you get married? All of the what rites of passage can you offer a 13-year-old?
What are you doing here? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
Just to be the first people in history to have absolutely no explanation for what we're doing at all. Is a big moment.
Yeah. Yes.
And
that sharpens up my concern perfectly, because to shrink back from that moment and resort to one of the pseudo stories of the past, I consider to be a failure of nerve, both intellectually and morally.
So let's go.
It's interesting that he characterizes that as a failure of nerve, because, of course, I'm going to bring my mic back in here, because, of course, well, this is the CPU world you're trying to live in. Okay, well, now we have to somehow create the stories necessary to replace all of the ancient ones that we've been living off forever. So let's sit down, and maybe we will have a department of non-religious storytelling that will... And now we're just sort of back into Jonathan Peugeot's land of his parasitic storytelling, where it's like, well, why don't you develop all of the stories that you need that are not patriarchal? All the stories that you need that are not heteronormative. All the stories that you need that are safe for the brave new world that you're trying to create. You can't make them. Why? Because where do the stories that we have come from? The stories that we have come from, again, watch Jordan Peterson's first biblical series. The stories that we have come from because we watch each other, and because our GPUs are abstracting this. There's something in Pocahontas that has attracted the attention of Jordan Peterson's granddaughter. There's something in Catwoman and Batgirl that has attracted Sam's daughters. And Sam, his CPU can't figure out the value of this, but this is what we do.
Let's go back to the superhero idea. One of the things you might notice about superheroes is that some of them are actually deities, right? So in the Marvel pantheon, you have Thor, for example, and so there's a very thin line between the idea of a superhero and the idea of a god, especially if you think about it in a polytheistic manner. So the modern superheroes and the Greek gods, for example, share a tremendous number of features in common. And so here's something to think about. So there's a reason that people admire superheroes, and it's because they act out parts of the hero archetype. That's the technical reason. They're obviously acting something out because that's how you can tell they're superheroes. They share some set of characteristics across the set of superheroes that makes them superheroes. Now the question might be, what is the essential element of being a superhero that makes you a superhero? And the answer, the way that was solved historically, is that as polytheistic societies developed, and that was usually a consequence of isolated tribes coming into contact with one another, they each had their separate deities. And then over the course of time, those deities warred in actual wars with people, but also conceptually. And out of that polytheistic framework was extracted something that was vaguely monotheistic, as all of...
And I actually think Jordan Peterson is wrong about this. And the reason I started out with that, but then the Meta-Divine Realm and, all of the stuff that I've been doing, I don't think he's right about it. And part of it is because you wind up with analogous gods and analogous pantheons in these worlds. And I think in some ways that goes to his argument, but in other ways it sort of cuts against it. One of the things I learned fairly early on with C.S. Lewis is his take on this. And part of what a really good thinker, how you know a really good thinker, is because his idea has tended to last through various, let's call them micro transformations within me, as I've been doing all of this learning and talking over the last few years. This is from Mere Christianity. The reason why it can never succeed is this: God made us, invented us as man invents an engine. A car is made to run on petrol, and it would not run properly on anything else. Now God designed the human machine to run on himself. Well, think about that. God designed the human machine to run on himself. What is God that we run on him? He himself is the fuel our spirits were designed to burn, or the food our spirits were designed to feed on. There is no other. That is why it is just no good asking God to make us happy in our own way without bothering about religion. God cannot give us a happiness and a peace apart from himself, because it is not there. There is no such thing. That's a lot of Christians will, so that's one of these underlined things in the Kindle book, and people are like, oh, excited about that. And why? Oh, because it's very tribal, and oh, we Christians feel like we're winning, we're doing that. Oh, okay. But when you read that and you really start to digest it, it's very strange. And it really takes a lot of thought, especially where he goes from here. That is the key to history. Terrific energies expended, civilizations are built up, excellent institutions devised, but each time something goes wrong. Some fatal flaw always brings the selfish and cruel people to the top, and it all slides back down into misery and ruin. In fact, the machine conks. It seems to start up all right and run a few yards, and then it breaks down. This is where you get this Lindy effect from Nassim Taleb, that long things really endure. And so, all the interesting aspects of Norse mythology, it just didn't finally stand up to Christianity. And now the question will be, well, will Christianity itself stand up? Because we've got these major religions and the conflicts that they're in. It seems they start up all right and run a few yards, and then they break down. They are trying to run on the wrong juice. That is what Satan has done to us humans. And what did God do? First of all, he left us conscience, the sense of right and wrong, and all through history there have been people trying, some of them very hard, to obey it. And again, I could probably do a whole video on conscience. And Peterson for a while was talking a lot about conscience. None of them ever quite succeeded. Second, he set the human race what I call good dreams. And Lewis was a lover of all things north, as he called them. I believe those queer stories scattered all through the heathen religions about a God who dies and comes to life again, and by his death has somehow given new life to men. Thirdly, he selected one particular people and spent several centuries hammering it into their heads the sort of God he was, and that there was only one of him, and that he cared about right conduct. Those people were Jews in the Old Testament, given an account of the hammering process. Okay, but this dreams, and for Lewis, that's what these religions are. And it's so interesting in at least the first little while of Vikings where Athelstan and Ragnar Lothbrok are sort of figuring out Odin, Christianity. And for a long time, Athelstan is wrestling with himself because, of course, he was within Christianity, but then he gets abducted and goes off with the Vikings. And now, well, there's power here too. And what is the relationship between Odin and the Christian God, and how do these relationships work? And this is, well, in many ways, what we're really in right now, because of the proliferation of platforms, is that we're sort of in a story multiplication supernova. Charles Taylor talks about the supernova of religiosity and, all of our buffered selves. And so we have all of these stories. And so comic books, I caught this video on Nerdwriter 1, about 3 million subs. So it's a major channel. Comic books, in 1938, well, what is 1938 close to? Well, you're getting to the end of the Great Depression, and you're 1939. Hitler is going to invade Poland. Already the Japanese are neck deep in China, and there's increasing tensions going, and the Soviet Union, of course. So there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot causing anxiety. And who shows up in the scene but Superman? And Superman is wearing what, green and yellow? No, he's wearing red, white, and blue. Truth, justice, and the American way. And basically what you have is all of these stories. Now, you might say, well, here's what makes Sam Harris's project just looks ridiculous. Because we are having a supernova of stories now. We are producing stories on these multiple platforms at a rate never before conceived of in human history. And two things are happening. On one hand, we sort of feel like there's why can't we develop anything new? Why is it always the sequels? Why is it always the same stories? On the other hand, there are two groups. Let's say one, the rationalists like Sam Harris that say, well, we need to somehow devise new things for weddings and funerals, and we need to do all of that work so that it can be clean room against religion. But then the other, we need to have all of these new woke stories. And from everything we've seen, both projects are complete failures, while we're producing new stories like crazy. And some are trying to, again, go back to Peugeot's parasitic storytelling. And I think that video is a masterpiece, because he nicely illustrates why both other projects are failing and they are not going to succeed. And so 1938, Superman comes on the scene. And one of my favorite Capra movies is Meet John Doe. Fascinating movie if you get a chance to see it, because, well, who is John Doe? Well, he's the everyman, and there's a deeply Christian theme in that movie. Maybe I should. I lost a member or two of my church once when I did a sermon, which was so much of. For a while, I was using a lot of movies when I was doing some sermons for a while. But Superman stops crime, okay? And he stops crime, and then the world sort of goes back to normal, and the world is set right. And you get this idea of, Mr. Incredible, and, I just cleaned this place up. Why is it a mess again? But Superman just keeps doing that. And so what is going on in the zeitgeist that Superman comes up? But then part of what we also know is that the zeitgeist is connected to the market. And Brett Weinstein was talking about the market. And so Brett's talking about, I take his point with respect to people, but I think his point is actually rather simplistic, because this has been going on for a long time. And it's images like these. I mean, just look at this little picture I've got on the screen of the first Superman comic. I mean, look at the guy in the foreground like this. You got Superman with the car, and, it's very dramatic. All right. And it's clean, and it's low resolution. And these are archetypal stories. But what happens in the market is that these things proliferate, because suddenly Superman is selling like crazy. And so now comic books just explode on the scene. Everybody can make comic books. And before you know it, Captain Marvel comes on the scene, and people begin to look at Captain Marvel, and he seems to be just like Superman. But, well, why would they be the same? And now there's some, and so this video from Nerdwriter, and I'm going to play it, and hopefully it goes okay in terms of the YouTube copyright stuff. We'll see. I'm always a little nervous. Jordan Peterson videos I usually don't have any trouble with, but we'll see how it goes for the other ones. But so then there's copyright dispute, because at some point Action Comics becomes DC Comics, and they look over at Marvel Comics, and it's like, hey, wait a minute. You're just ripping them off. Is he ripping them off? Kind of. But it's also coming out of the same soup, isn't it? And, okay. you're just ripping them off. And then the Brits kind of take off where they leave off, and they were making money out of it, and there's an embargo. There's all kinds of stuff that happens. But then a new writer in the 80s comes on the scene, and things start to change. And now I had to learn a new word when I began listening to this video: retcon. And I didn't know what that was. A film, television series, or other fictional work, a piece of new information that imposes a different interpretation on previously described events. This is exactly what Jordan Peterson was talking about in his classes when he said, your wife comes home and says, I've been having an affair for 10 years. Boom, you're no longer living in the same marriage. This is what happens in the world. And this is where we get into this narrative stuff, because one thing that happens now, boom, total remapping of my world. And it forces a transformation. And now suddenly I have to recalibrate and rewrite, and my map outside and my map inside, and the story outside changes who I am and the story inside. And this massive thing happens. And this is what happens with this Alan Moore, who begins to redo Marvel Man, and it will eventually become Miracle Man.
Ginn decided to revive Marvel Man for his new comics anthology, Warrior, and settled on a young writer named Alan Moore to do it. What resulted changed superhero comics and superheroes forever. This is Alan Moore's Marvel Man. You can tell from the first few pages that this Marvel Man is radically different from his previous incarnation. Mickey Moran is no longer a child. He's a disheveled man of middle age, still a reporter, but financially insecure. And most importantly, he has no memory of ever being a superhero.
Now this is fascinating because, again, you look at the DC Comics of the 30s, and when you watch movies from the Second World War. Now, again, if you look at a Ken Burns documentary like The Pacific, what's going on underneath is one thing, but the stories we would tell ourselves in public. I mean, another one of my theses is that, if the story outside and the story inside are vitally important, and the connection between them is vitally important, the kinds of ways that we tell stories on the outside are vitally important. And of course, in World War II, you've got a fair amount of propagandistic storytelling. The government is not going to allow certain things. And in fact, the entire zeitgeist and the culture of what radio and government and newspapers are for, while even into the 60s, when John F. Kennedy, who's something of a sex addict, is sleeping with starlets in the White House, reporters are looking the other way. And you begin to get a sense of the world has changed. And, so now with this Captain Marvel, it used to be, I remember as a kid, there was this cartoon, Shazam, and I didn't know the origins of this, but, it was kind of a hip young man who turns into this adult man, and boy, you could have a lot of fun seeing through that. But now in the 80s, everything is now grimy. And what's the truth? And it's so interesting because as he sort of walks through this, I can see, oh my goodness, all of this has been ripped off by other things. You can find, even in The Incredibles, when you look at things, you can find all of these themes that others read in this as kind of the root story and then continued to develop in other places.
Though he is having some strange... He has no memory of ever being a superhero. Though he is having some strange dreams. At a hijack...
And again, the dreams. Okay, well, it's the dreams. What are the dreams? Well, the dreams are sort of our way of... We're regulating the story at night. Okay? And again, it's not our conscious minds doing it.
A few panels later, Moran discovers the triggering word, Kitoma, and explodes into Marvel Man. Suddenly remembering the history of his heroic exploits, he flies home to tell his wife who he really is, and she laughs in his face.
That's genius.